Check, check, 1, 2. Darren, can you hear us okay? Check, check. How do I spotlight him? How do I spotlight him? Oh, I have to admit him. Oh, I have to admit him. I had to admit him. So he's joining now. There he is.
And then spotlight him, so that's all we see when I bring it up as him, right? And the panel will see him be a little hot.
I don't know if I can I spotlight him? Because if it's only him in the call, does it have to be at least 3 participants to spotlight him?
Yeah, that's perfect. He just doesn't have his camera on.
I just see a picture of him.
There he is. Hey, Darren, you hearing us okay? Is that mic on? Hey, Darren, you hearing us okay? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, can you hear me?
Hey, Darren, you hearing us okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Getting a frozen image from you, but it doesn't look like your
Yeah, I can hear
internet
you
is
fine.
great.
Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Okay, at least we can see you. That's good.
Oh, is that the problem?
Yeah, your internet looks like it's all red, so I don't. But I can, as long as we can hear you, we're getting a static
Okay.
image of you.
Do you want me to shut my camera off?
No, I think it's good to have it on. Don't you think? Yeah, we want to be able to see you. Well, that's a nice picture too. Yeah, I can bring them up for
Okay, is that better?
you. Right now, we're just seeing a
Okay.
black screen.
It's your,
We're not getting
your
a camera
preference,
image
whatever
for
you
you.
prefer.
It says your network bandwidth is really low, so maybe you're better off not using your camera. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you okay over here, Darren.
Okay, thanks.
Change those. They don't go anywhere.
shoes. How do you do it?
Yeah, I had them in my office. I haven't worn them since my house, so.
Yeah, because I was like trying on shoes. I'm just, oh no, I can't wear them. And I said, I took this dress out of the plastic, which has been dry cleaned, and it was staticky. So I thought, oh, this is the dress I'm gonna wear. But do we want to order?
And I thought, can I give you this? Now you're stuck, you can't leave. You're stuck with me, you can't leave.
I invite you to all just move over one. Kiki and I are going to sit on opposite sides. So
Move down.
we have no music though when we're playing this game.
No?
Music.
I can sing though. Oh yeah, that's right, because Darren is not present, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Comforter stare by Darren, and then
But I like how your mask matches the lace detail on your shirt. Very good.
Yeah. It's deliberate.
I know. I'm admiring you for it.
mine matches everything.
I know.
It's basic black, it works for all three.
Exactly.
Class,
Basic
all
black.
kinds, yeah. Tuxedo. I like that notebook a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. Absolutely. And she said we can take off our masks when we speak. Okay. Heather. Good afternoon. How are we doing today? All right. Welcome, fellow Beacons and those who are joining us from wherever they are, Beacons and friends. Welcome you to our Does Democracy Protect Freedom panel, sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Tyson King Meadows. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And my partner in crime, Dean Itosi from the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies. We had what we thought was a very simple premise. Can policy studies help us solve the threat to democracy in the nation and the world? And as we began to unpack that question, we realized it wasn't as simple or easy. And so we wanted to invite panelists that were going to help us interrogate all those assumptions about what is a threat, what is a democracy, what is freedom, and give us some really interesting things to think about, and that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to just introduce some of the panelists from CLA and then introduce my partner in crime. I want us to think about this moment and the importance of UMass Boston putting on this program at this moment, because beacons are beacons of light and understanding, and that's what we're trying to do. So let me introduce the panelists. So the first panelist that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Ghanari. She's a professor of applied linguistics here. Using her background in critical applied linguistics, she weaves policy, language, and discourse together with insights from her 20-year career in public higher education to produce socially committed research. Her focus is on critical discourse, and her latest book explores the far-right authoritarian populist discourses in social media in the context of Trump's presidency and the January 6th insurrection. She's going to bring us a lot of information to help us deconstruct some of these things. The next panelist from the College of Liberal Arts is Dr. Joseph Brown. He's an associate professor of political science. His research focuses on political conflict, including terrorism, protests, state repression, and ethnic violence. His latest book, Force of Words, The Logic of Terrorist Threats, explores how non-state terrorist groups use threats to coerce their opponents and shape the physical and political outcomes of violence. Before joining UMass Boston, he worked as a media analyst in one of my hometowns, Washington, D.C. He earned a political science degree, PhD, from Columbia University in 2015. So we wanted the best and brightest to come up and tell us about what we were seeing right now. And so my partner in crime, let me introduce my partner in crime, Dr. Kiki Adosi, appointed Dean of the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies in 2021. Let me say this. She is the fourth dean, but she comes with many firsts, including the first female dean, the first dean of color, the first traditional academic dean, and the first dean with global policy expertise. Kiki, as we all know her, and she calls herself, brings a 20-year leadership record in public affairs and global studies to her faculty and administrative portfolio, beginning her career in 2001 with an appointment at the Institute of African Studies Deputy Director at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in New York City. Since joining UMass Boston in 2017 as the Associate Dean, Kiki achieved several accomplishments in her short 4-year tenure, including establishing the first-time student resources program, the Dean's Office Faculty Fund for Advancing Research, and the McCormack Racial Equity Task Force. She earned her PhD in Politics and International Relations from New York City's New School for Social Research in 1999, which gave her a long-standing teaching and research expertise platform in African affairs, comparative democracy, global development, and race relations. Prior to that, she went through the full rank from assistant to full at Michigan State University. She's an accomplished scholar, published 8 books that cover all kinds of topics, and several peer-reviewed authors. There's a forthcoming book about Africa's new global politics, recognition, and international relations. So when we thought together, how could we bring our scholars from 2 different colleges that are united in our love for policy, united in our commitment to interrogate large questions, there was no other partner that I wanted but Dr. Adosi.
Thank you so much, Dean King Meadows. All right, let me just get my, sorry, put my earring back on, excuse me. All right, thank you, Dean King Meadows, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone today's exciting event, just the same. Let me tell you about my colleague, Dean Tyson King Meadows. He is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and he is a professor of political science here at the great University of Massachusetts, Boston. But before joining UMass Boston, Dr. King Meadows was a professor of political science at the University of Baltimore County, UMBC, and he was also the 2019-2020 American Council on Education Fellow at Case Western Reserve at the University of Cleveland, Ohio. Tyson's research interests include public opinion, African American electoral behavior, voting rights, and U.S. political institutions, and he has published a range of scholarly articles and monographs, including Devolution and Black State Legislators' Challenges and Choices in the 21st Century, and he's also written When the Letter Betrays the Spirit, Voting Rights, Enforcement, and African American Participation from Lyndon Johnson to Barack Obama. Tyson's teaching and research endeavors have been supported by several institutions, including the American Political Science Association, the National Science Foundation, Johns Hopkins University, Harvard University, Princeton University, and the U.S. State Department, including the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Dr. Meadows has also served as a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Ghana, and he has been the W.U.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University, and he's been an APSA Congressional Fellow with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary. Over his 18-year career at UMBC, Dr. King Meadows held numerous positions, including he was the Associate Provost for Strategic Initiatives. He was the Associate Dean for Research and College Affairs for the College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences, and he was the Chair of the Department of Africana Studies. And currently, Dr. King Meadows holds a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's no better collaborator than Dr. Tyson King Meadows in this fascinating event that we're going to have today. Let me also, since we're on introductions, introduce the two panelists that hail from the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies. They are Dr. Professor Pamela Nadash, who is an associate professor with us. Professor Nadash is an associate professor of gerontology, and she is also a fellow of the Leading Age LTSS Center at UMass Boston's Gerontology Institute. Her work centers on health policy and aging, specifically the policies that enable people to access the supportive services they need. This work includes a focus on the financing of long-term services and supports, nursing home quality, home and community-based services, and supportive housing. It also includes looking cross-nationally at different countries' long-term care financing and service delivery systems. Dr. Nadash has published in Health Affairs, Health Services Research, The Gerontologist, and the Milbank Quarterly. Thank you, Pam, for participating in today's important event. Our other panelist is online. If you look behind you, you will see he is zooming in from Northern Ireland, where he is currently a Fulbright Scholar. Professor Darren Pugh is an associate professor of conflict resolution with the John McCormack School, and he's also the executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development. Dr. Q studies the relationship between conflict resolution and democratic development, largely in Africa. He is the executive director of the CPTD. Much of his work focuses on the role of civil society groups in democratic development, He monitored, the last 3 Nigerian elections and the 2017 elections in Sierra Leone. Professor Q has worked with the Council of Foreign Relations, the Center for Preventive Action, and he provides, really comprehensive analysis and blueprints for preventing conflicts around the world. So let me sort of try to transition this program. I'd like to welcome you, Darren. Darren, if you can hear us, can you just do a shout out?
Yes, I can hear you.
There
Thanks.
he is. Thanks, Darren. Let me transition the program a little bit. I did want to talk a little bit about the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies and the importance of this collaboration with the College of Liberal Arts and today's program. Our school, fondly named Mccormack, or the Mccormack School, I think enlivens the tradition of the school's namesake, and that is the great former Congressman John W. McCormack, who served as Massachusetts representative in Congress from 1928 to 1971. It enlivens his spirit in its commitment to social justice and economic mobility, which lives on at our school that we proudly bear his name. Our academic and community programs keep McCormack's legacy alive by training the next generation of academic activists and policy practitioners who make an impact in their local and global communities. We were founded in 1983 as the John McCormack Institute of Public Affairs. We were founded as an applied public policy research center focusing on issues of immediate concern to Boston, the Commonwealth, the New England region, and to the world. In 2010, we further expanded to become the small college school that we are today, convening nationally and internationally recognized policy studies education that fuses applied policy research and public service in a single mission through graduate training and advanced undergraduate teaching and learning. In addition to 3 really strong academic departments, we also include 14 programs, and the current school delivers its historical educational mission through 7 major outreach and research centers and institutes. So according to one former UMass Boston chancellor, her name was Sherry Penny, the late Sherry Penny. She said, "A democratic nation cannot sustain itself without constantly applying intelligence and energy to solving its problems and improving the lives of its citizens." UMass Boston, she said, is fortunate to have the McCormack School, which represents a perfect model of the way that universities can successfully integrate scholarship and public service. So that's how the McCormack faculty and student scholars see themselves, as a bridge to the worldwide community of connections and partnerships with public and private institutions that are all co-creating meaningful intellectual and experiential exchanges for UMass Boston, for the greater Boston community, and the Commonwealth and the world. We hope to use our programs to engage policy and public service studies as lenses through which to conduct interdisciplinary, problem-solving, community-engaged, transnational, and global policy research and programming. So it's in this spirit that we are co-hosting today's event to embody several important questions. Two of them are, can policy studies solve the impending threats to democracy in the nation and the world? And today, does democracy protect freedom? We hope to engage you with insightful dialogues through our policy studies practitioners and professors. And we hope to underscore research that examines the relationship between democracy and freedom and their impact on the US and contemporary democracies around the world. So let me give this back to Tyson to hopefully ask the first set of questions, and I'll come up later to ask others.
All right. So, like at the presidential debate, we have the first question is really the one that opens up the dialogue for us to really interrogate who we are and who we think we can be, and what kind of institutions we might construct, and the assumptions underlying the construction of those institutions. So, here's my first question. How does your teaching and research engage the concepts of democracy and freedom?
We can go in order.
Yes.
We have mics on the floor.
Okay. Well, I'm the linguist here, so probably people may be wondering, how is linguistics relevant to democracy and freedom? Yeah. So, and this is a question I often get also in conferences. What is linguistics and how is it relevant to questions of democracy, equity, human rights? And so I always say that we linguists who do socially engaged research, we start from a social problem, any social problem that has some sort of linguistic manifestation. It's manifested linguistically. It illustrates in the way we talk, in the way we write, in the texts we are surrounded with. And so, for example, in my own research, my most recent research, I tried to answer, to look into a social problem that was the rise of far-right populism in the United States and abroad through a series of linguistic questions. So I looked at Trumpism as an embodiment of far-right populism, and I was curious to find out how social media language, discourses used in social media, mostly on Twitter, but also on two conservative platforms like Parler and Telegram, who were used after the massive exodus of Trumpists from Facebook, also known as Fakebook, by this group of people. So how were these people talking about what is going on? And most essentially, how this chatter culminated to what we now know as the January 6th insurrection. So I looked specifically at these discussions taking place in social media, leading to the events of the Capitol insurrection, and also checked them with what President Trump was talking at the time. And so I was trying to see from a linguistic point of view, how can we unpack why far-right populism exists in the United States, and how is it embodied in these discourses? So that's one of the ways that a linguist can engage with issues of democracy, because I mean, ultimately, when we talk about far-right populism, we are really talking about a major threat to democracy. Most importantly, a major threat to democracy that takes place within a democratic context, which to me was fascinating.
Okay, I am going to unmask briefly to
discuss how my own teaching deals with these issues. My own research area, my primary area is terrorism and political conflict. And so these topics come up in class partly in general, talking about, well, what is democracy and what is freedom? Because I think they come up in any political science class, but they also intersect with this kind of thorny social and policy problem of political violence. So in addition to thinking about what is democracy and what is freedom, we tend to confront questions like, does terrorism relate to democracy? Do terrorist groups tend to thrive in democratic political systems, or do they arise in autocratic political systems? Is the state itself engaged in acts of terrorism? Can you define terrorism in such a way that does not implicate the state and some of its core behaviors, such as suppressing domestic political dissent to one degree or another, or enforcing law? There's a certain kind of symbolic violence involved in all law enforcement. So the topic of democracy and freedom intersects quite a lot with the topic of terrorism. There's also the kind of applied policy question of if you're in a polity and political violence has broken out, perhaps some non-state actor, those are the ones I tend to look at for the most part, is engaging in political violence. Does that mean that the public needs to accept limitations on its freedoms because of the potential that violent non-state actors might take advantage of the freedoms afforded by a liberal political system to ultimately undo the system itself? And there is some precedent for that. My research area concerns threats in particular, so like explicit statements threatening violence against other people. So that I think there are questions about free speech, both in person and on the internet, and whether there ought to be limitations on that, or whether political violence arises in unfree systems, and the best way to inoculate yourself against the emergence of political violence is by offering opportunities to participate in politics via nonviolent means, even if the things you have to say might not be especially popular. So.
Thank you. Okay, does that work? Yes, it does. Okay. So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what on earth gerontology has to do with democracy and freedom. I define the area of work that I do as public policy and aging. And so a lot of what I'm doing when I'm teaching is to give people who are working in the field of aging the tools they need to make change. So, a lot of people are working out there on the ground. Not working? Yeah, all functional. Is that better? Okay, there we go. So a lot of people are out there working on the ground, and you don't really understand how their context is being shaped by politics. And in order to understand that, they need to understand how our world works and what they can do to make change. So I really see that, particularly in one of our programs, as one of my key goals, giving people those tools, the understanding, and also the confidence to speak up and to make concrete changes. And so, a lot of the, older people are in many ways disenfranchised, and the people who serve them are equally pretty low on the totem pole. So what we're, so for me, it's a sort of critical rights issue to sort of give these people those tools, and also to sort of get them to understand that the things they're experiencing are not merely personal. And so, we've all heard that expression, the personal is political. And, what we're trying to do in the field of aging is to get people to raise their awareness that things that they're experiencing are not merely individual, but have systemic aspects to them. And so the work I've been doing most recently has to do with trying to elevate awareness of family caregiving. Now, the conversation in the media is all about, people's personal experiences of having an aging relative. Well, those personal experiences are very much conditioned by the political and social environment we currently live in. And, right now the trendy phrase in public health is the social determinants of health. And so all of these factors, all the ways in which our society is failing to do what a good society does, which is to protect its citizens, by assuring access to reasonable housing, by assuring access to health care. All of these things are framing these experiences and leaving older people very vulnerable. And so, the hope is that by engaging in political processes, this can eventually sort of make change. However, I'm sure we're going to move on to this conversation about how well that system is actually working. So I think I'll stop there. I can talk for a long time.
Darren?
Hi there. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first, thanks again to all of you for putting up with me being on the Zoom tonight, and thanks for inviting me to join. I think in answer to your question, the way I think about teaching on these issues is very much influenced by the research that I've done. In particular, a central sort of point of argument that I make is that if you look at the values that underlie most conflict resolution and peace building approaches, they are essentially one and the same as the values we associate with democracy, such that if you were to institutionalize a peace process or build institutions around it, you would basically get some sort of form of democratic system. And in the same way, if you want to make a democratic system more democratic and more functional and able to protect freedoms, you need to teach or inculcate or socialize people in deeper conflict resolution skills, peace building, negotiation, mediation, nonviolence, peace building, nonviolent movement building. All of these are essential skills of democracy. So I think in the classroom, I certainly try to not only sort of teach this stuff, but also try to embody it in terms of the way we run classes as much as possible. And I think that's really important. The other thing I think it's important to remember too worldwide is that, freedom is always a negotiated concept in the sense that, your freedom goes as far as my freedom, the limits of my freedom, and vice versa. And among groups, no group has absolute total freedom. We always have to negotiate, what it is we want and need and desire in the context of other people. So these kinds of negotiation skills and how we negotiate freedom is something I think is really important in our classroom to think about. How do we think about the rights that people deserve in the context of other people who have other rights that they also deserve, and have different opinions about how those rights are to be respected. So I think those are all fundamental to a peace-building conflict resolution classroom.
Thank you. Excellent. Do you see the relevance of policy studies? We've gone from communications to sociology, anthropology, economics, American studies, all of the wonderful things that are in the College of Liberal Arts, the foundation, philosophy. We're interrogating the meaning of words, meaning and the institutions that develop based upon those words. I don't know, I'm geeked out. I don't know about you, but I have a second question. Do democracy and freedom mean the same thing?
That is a hard question, because I think in order to answer it, we would need to think about context. As I said earlier, when I talked about my research, to me it was interesting that this phenomena of far-right populism, and far-right populism includes racism, classism, sexism. So it's a really interesting ideological mix where everybody feels welcome, actually, to pick their enemy. So this populism thrives in so-called democratic countries. The United States is one of them. But the United States is not at the forefront, really. Far-right populism emerged in Europe. in the 80s. So if we look at those political systems and regimes there, they are democratic. These are bourgeois democracies, right? And yet in the context of these democracies, we have these movements and that are embodied also in political parties that eventually make it to the parliament. Greece is also a case in point, and I also want to mention the recent French elections, which I'm sure all of you have followed. I mean, we have a far-right neo-Nazi party, essentially, that is the second power in France. And France is a democracy with an incredible history, right, from Enlightenment to today. So I think we need to talk about what democracy and what kinds of freedoms we are talking about. So, I'm also thinking that very often in the context of these democracies, freedom is often perceived the freedom to pursue individual interests, or the freedom to consume, for example, the freedom to choose. What does it mean to choose? Can everybody have access to choosing different things? Do we all have access to choose from a wide range of options, right? So both freedom and democracy, I think, need to be contextualized in a way for us to answer this question. I mean, I think we could be talking all day just about this question.
I've also got a lot to say on this topic, and I'll try and keep it very concise. Do they mean the same thing? No, I don't think they do. They are closely related. So democracy, I think, in its ideal form, allows people a voice in how society is governed, and I think that implies a degree of freedom of each person to participate. It also implies a degree of egalitarianism. Democracy is distinct from dictatorship, monarchy, or oligarchy, and oligarchy is a thing that can emerge when some people are more free than others. For instance, in a system that equates campaign donations with political speech and argues that the freedom to donate to political candidates should be essentially unlimited, assuming you follow the right tax rules. A few very wealthy people exerting that kind of freedom can crowd out the voices of millions of other people whose ability to participate in a truly democratic system has been effectively curtailed. So it depends on how we want to define freedom, and whether some people insist on unlimited personal freedoms when their freedoms start to infringe on others' freedoms and the democratic system itself. I will also say that the rhetoric of democracy can often be used to take freedoms away, and I think that we saw this with the recent Samuel Alito draft Supreme Court opinion revoking the right to abortion care, which invoked the logic of, or the sort of institutional logic of democracy. Oh, there's a legislature which needs to vote on whether whether pregnant people have access to abortion care. There you see perhaps the most fundamental freedom, the freedom of bodily autonomy, being revoked under a sort of quasi-democratic logic of, oh, it should be put to a vote, including the votes of people who can't possibly be pregnant. So beware the use of democratic rhetoric to take freedoms away.
Yeah, this is such a big question. It's really hard to sort of think how to answer it. So one of the ways I thought about it was to think, does democracy guarantee freedom? And I think I think one of the lessons of the last, I mean, two centuries at minimum, is that democracy does not guarantee freedom. We have all, and I think, the reason that's so important to emphasize right now, the Washington Post says, democracy dies in darkness. And I do think, hopefully everyone is all too conscious of how fragile our democracy is. And the democracy does not work unless we have vital institutions that people believe in. And, obviously what's happening. I'm sorry, is that better? Okay, sorry. So we've seen many, many democracies overthrown, and we've seen places like Brazil right now, where, it started out kind of as a democracy, and now it's going away. It's very easy for autocrats to undermine all the institutions that guarantee some level of freedom. So we really need to take that very seriously, and we need to think very hard about, this is where we sort of go into, what are our shared beliefs, and the fact that we no longer have shared beliefs. And, it's when I think about freedom, we've talked a lot about different ways to conceptualize freedom. And I always go back to my political theory days where, you have the three faces of power. You have freedom from, freedom to, and then this third face of power, which is all about the ideas you're able to have. And what's happening now is people are getting locked into a world where certain ideas are only accessible to them, and we don't have a shared language anymore. So this is a critical factor, and I think it really does limit freedom to the extent that it reduces our ability to talk to one another and our ability to share ideals. I'll just stop there.
Darren, go ahead, please.
Sorry, did you want me to go ahead, or you want me to wait a sec?
My question for you was, does democracy threaten freedom, or are they the same thing? Are you there?
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to start a new round. Yes, of course. Well, so, I mean, the relationship between democracy and freedom, I was thinking about, and about the meaning of the terms as well, as Tyson suggested, in two lights, and which echoes a little bit what my colleagues just say. I think one, is this tension in our notion of freedom as, living in a way with sort of minimal controls over your life and being able to live the life you want without sort of, as some people might feel, an obtrusive government role or from other groups. And then on the other side, a more of an egalitarian perspective, as Joe was suggesting, that says, freedom actually, needs to have a certain amount of social support in order to have a decent life so that you can make the choices that you need. And I think that's an inherent tension. And democracy really is sort of the system that we use to try to mediate that conversation. I think a second point I'd want to make is democratic systems in particular rely very much on a balance of power. In the United States, we talk a lot about checks and balances. But checks and balances are really based upon a balance of power in the system. And it's not just simply between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, though those balances are very important. In much of the world, we see overpowerful executives as a very big problem. But there also has to be a balance between the public and the government. And the public is a critical actor in building that, balancing the power of the state. And I'm thinking in particular of civil society groups in this role, nonviolent movements, and the media. And I think we're in a time period where much of the world, especially because of the impacts of social media, where those balances are very much tipped in the wrong direction. And the public dimension of it is something to talk about later nations there.
Thank you, Darren, and thank you all panelists for answering our first set of questions, which really tried to get to definitional and conceptual questions around democratization, democracy, freedom, human rights. The best definition of our democracy that I know is that democracy is really messy. It's messy, it's not straightforward, and nobody knows what it is. But let's move to some more empirical questions about, the way that democracy is manifest around the world. My first question to that effect is, is the U.S. still the beacon of democracy around the world? I mean, right here in Boston, beacons on the hill. We are known to be at least the inventors of democracy and freedom, so to speak, or the modernizers of democracy. Inventors were Athens. But are we still relevant in democracy promotion around the world? That's my question to any of you. The question? Yeah, are we still the beacon? Are we, being the US, are we still the beacon of democracy around the world?
Okay, I can take a stab on that. I was asked here by my colleague to talk about it because I am Greek. So maybe I can bring a perception from how the United States is seen outside of the United States, even though I'm sure you all know about it. When I hear this question, my first reaction is, when was the United States a beacon for democracy? Because when I think about that, I think about, for example, all the US interventions across the world. I don't know how many there are up to this day. Maybe we're in 80 or 100 interventions with the goal to democratize. And the end result was to establish dictatorships or, oppressive governments. So meddling also with foreign elections. So I think when we want to address this question, we really need to consider this troubling history of the United States democratizing. Again, from a linguistic point of view, the wording is important. So how we label what we are doing in other countries. We democratize or we export democracy. What does it mean we export democracy? We have too much of it here and, we send it abroad. So I think it would be interesting to look at this from, this perspective of the United States exporting democracy.
Great. Others? Darren, this is probably something for you. Darren Q's work is a lot about democratization around the world, especially in the developing world.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's certainly something I think about a lot in terms of global political culture. If you think about the culture of an organization is tremendously impacted by the leadership and the body language of that leadership. The United States being, certainly one of the powerful countries in the world, its body language has a tremendous impact. And, certainly the previous administration in the United States worldwide sent very mixed messages about democracy promotion. Although, certainly there are some, I think, as could be rightly raised about the Obama administration as well in terms of concerns the way democracy was promoted overseas. But the point is that, certainly over the last 5 years, sort of American, at least seeming indifference towards the democratic push worldwide has strengthened the hands of authoritarians in many parts of the world. And honestly, I think it's blown back on our own democracy here in many ways. When we see that, militia groups have been forming, over the years and played critical roles in the 2020 election, threatening to kidnap and kill the Michigan governor and, the Maryland governor at different points, and, the activities of, militant supporters of different candidates, intimidating, communities that are likely to vote on the other side. This is all extremely dangerous and difficult. So I think that we are certainly still a model, but not a perfect model by any stretch of the imagination. I think we're more a model of a flawed democracy trying to improve itself and trying to sort of deal with the stresses of the shifts in the world. As I mentioned, the massive impacts of social media on just our political culture and the way our world is organized, as well as the concentration of financial wealth increasingly in the hands of less and less people, are just skewing the way that the politics are structured. And I think the way that we deal with these in the years to come will certainly teach lessons worldwide. Hopefully they'll be good lessons.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Let me ask Pam and Joe another question, but related question. Is the U.S., is democracy in decline in the U.S.? Are we in decline in terms of democracy?
Yeah, so I think at this stage in the game, we sort of, the current political situation, I think we have to say yes, it's in decline. I mean, because democracy, like I said before, it only works if people believe in it and participate in it and feel that it's fair. And I think, the central crisis of our moment right now is that both on the right and on the left, we're not feeling it's fair. On the right, people believe in the big lie that the election, there's enormous fraud. I don't need to repeat on all of that. And on the left, I think this needs to be, I don't feel this is necessarily articulated all that clearly, but on the left, there's a crisis of the majority. And so what I mean by that is, Democrats won, how many elections now where we had the majority of the votes and a Republican was put into place. Now that didn't just happen at the federal level. That's also happened at the state level, where in many, many cases what you have is, I think there was a case in Wisconsin where 51% of the votes were Democrat and went toward Democratic representatives at the state legislature. And yet 60 out of 99 Republicans were elected because of gerrymandering.
Yeah.
So you have that kind of situation. So it's not just the frustration at the federal level. It's not just what's going on in the Supreme Court right now. It's happening at every level. And I think there is, and let's add on all the voting rights stuff on top of that, right? So it's coming from a lot of different angles, this lack of legitimacy. And I just think that's a huge challenge that we really are going to have to face because, I'm sure we're going to talk about how frustration, I think you said, comes out in different kinds of ways and unfortunately not in the best kinds of ways. So I'll just stop there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And thank you to Panayota for bringing the perspective about U.S. interventions abroad to allegedly promote democracy, but in practice promote, national interest. On the topic of whether the U.S. is in a sort of democratic decline, I think it's difficult to measure because there have always been people or political forces in the U.S. who have viewed democracy as existentially dangerous to them, and this goes all the way back to the founding of the U.S. state. I mean, the sacrosanct Constitution that we have, that is supposedly the gift of the infinite wisdom of the framers, has a lot of really bad things built into it. Most fundamentally, it has the enslavement of African people and the genocide and dispossession of indigenous people. That it's built in. So, some of those things we have been working on, and others of those things we have not. Right? Slavery is theoretically gone, but we still have the widespread disenfranchisement of Black Americans via not just gerrymandering, but these racist voter suppression laws, a racialized system of policing, and the disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions. And I don't think those things are an accidental combination. I think those are part of a fear in some sectors of what happens if Black people actually have equal political power. I think that I spoke a little bit earlier about the sort of oligarchic impulses of some people in the U.S., and that has always existed. That's why we have a Senate and an electoral college. I think that things have improved. Women have the right to vote now, but obviously other rights of women are under attack at this point. I think that it would be hard to say when the United States became a democracy, but it's because it's always been a work in progress, and things are certainly better now on some fronts than they have been in the more distant past. Other things are not. Here we are on Massachusetts land, and we still haven't addressed the issue of indigenous land theft, and we're nowhere close to addressing the issue of reparations for all the wealth stolen from enslaved people. So,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all on that. Yes, of course. Briefly, please.
Yeah, actually, you made me think about it. I mean, I'm thinking maybe a better way to think about this question is to say that democracy is not in decline, but it's in crisis. And crisis, to me, is always an opportunity, you know? It can go both ways, but I think it is in crisis because people's needs and desires and aspirations are not represented in the political landscape, sadly. And when we talk about democracy, we really talk about representation. So I'm thinking that, for example, the explosion of inequality since the economic crisis of 2008, and then the quashing of labor unions, I mean, these create an explosive environment where people need a place to identify with. For lack of other alternatives, they turn to people like Trump, like Bolsonaro, like Le Pen in France. So I think we should be talking about crisis of democracy that is also an opportunity to rethink what democracy means and how it should look like, maybe from grassroots movements and these kinds of, the representation of these people.
Fantastically well said, Panayota, and all of our panelists. I'm going to ask one major big question about democracy around the world, and then I really, want Tyson and I to, move over to our policy and freedom questions, which are much more sort of engaging. So this question is about the other elephant in the world room, that's Russia. And how are we to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine in terms of democracy and freedom? Maybe we should have Darren speak to that first, since he is in Northern Ireland currently.
Sure. Well, I think there's certainly been a lot discussed in the media and worldwide in terms of just the reinforcing again of what we were saying earlier about authoritarian patterns worldwide, in the sense that the only way really to see Ukraine is the move by an authoritarian power to assert its control over a sovereign state that it feels should not be sovereign, and the implications of this worldwide, if it is able to succeed, certainly adds some measure of legitimacy for any other sort of authoritarian government out there that decides it has some territorial ambitions on its neighbors to project its power. I mean, I think Panayota is right to note that powerful states, democratic and authoritarian, have a tendency to do this regardless. But the situation in Ukraine is so blatant and it's so obvious, and the use of military force is so extensive. And particularly because there were so many other negotiated alternatives that were available to work out at least my sense of what Russian key interests in Ukraine are that were not pursued effectively. I think for all those reasons, it sets a tremendously bad precedent. And I think what worries me, although I think like everyone, I'm heartened by Ukraine's ability to fight back and sort of hold its own, I still think that this creates even greater incentive for the Russian government to continue the activities it's been doing worldwide to try to undermine elections and undermine democratic governments, certainly across Europe and Africa. And obviously they interfered in the 2016 election in the United States. So I think this is only going to create even greater incentive depending on sort of the limits of Russian resources, to try to work against democratic thing about so far.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, others, what about this, Russia-Ukrainian, crisis and the crises of democracy? What does it mean?
Technical
We're
malfunction.
going to talk
here.
about masks and freedom in a minute.
Masks and glasses are a very awkward combination. So I would say that the Russian intervention in Ukraine, there's many different ways to try and explain why Vladimir Putin is doing the thing that he's doing. And I think a lot of it might relate to some very non-political science, but very important personal motivations like seeking glory, things that philosophers talked about a long time ago that people are still pursuing, the people wanting to be great men in history. But there is a more proximal cause, which is a political process in Ukraine where there's a political revolution that occurred and an effort to redirect politics away from the Russia-friendly autocrat system to a system that would have more freedoms and more liberal representation. And that seems to be a departure point in Putin's thinking about Ukraine. So there clearly are implications for a discussion of Ukraine and Russia in the context of talking about freedom and democracy. I do think it's also important not to necessarily lionize one state or another. I mean, there's critiques of all states. I certainly think we've offered some of the United States, and all states they all exist in an awkward relationship with democracy. The state is a very hierarchical organization. It's important to acknowledge that. But some are more hierarchical and centralized and autocratic than others. I think you could look at this as a data point to say that, well, perhaps if Russia had had a more democratic political system, there might have been more restraints on one person's vanity project becoming this really dreadful invasion.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much. Tyson, do we want to move to these policy and freedom questions? Yes, why don't you sit down and pick up your mic and start with the first set of questions, and I'll stay right here to do the others. You choose a couple from our first set of policy questions. We have some exciting questions.
Is this on?
Not yet?
Is it on?
Yes.
All right. So we talked a little bit about reproductive rights. We also talked a little bit about gerrymandering. So I want to go to the anti-crit and the Don't Say Gay bills. Do you think those limit freedom, and in what specific ways? The anti-crit and the Don't Say Gay bills and that whole movement around those two policies, do you think they limit freedom, and in what ways?
And the anti-crit is the anti-critical race theory movement.
I mean, I think that's really easy. Yes, of course they do. I'm trying to think of a way to make the answer more interesting. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is a case where America is experiencing a populist, moment right now, and political scientists, historians will say this is not the only time this has happened. I mean, we go through these things, and, the long-term view could be that, hey, we're just having a moment and the pendulum will swing back, and let's just, tough this out, and hopefully things will go back the right way and people will come to their senses. I mean, but, it's very hard to sort of think about how to negotiate this, because people are locked into a certain way of thinking about the world and what's going to shift them over. I mean, as a public health person, I cannot help but be dismayed by the lack of impact that facts have. A recent study just came out that showed that red states have higher COVID deaths. Not just red states, sorry, red counties. You can go by county basis, and you can look at how red the county is, and the states that had higher proportions of Trump voters have higher death rates from COVID. There's very little there's no more stark, demonstration of the impact of certain, policies on individuals. I mean, death could not be a stronger impact. So the question is going to be, what is going to stop people from rallying around these Republican-created talking points that are really super effective at energizing people. I mean, that's what's so frightening about it. I mean, people leap onto these bandwagons in a seemingly very manufactured kind of way and not aware of how, and this, I should let you talk now, like how this works. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Go ahead, Panita.
Yeah, so I've been following particularly the anti-CRT debate. It's not new, and I think it has a great deal to do with how far-right, alt-right, racism, white supremacist discourses have been normalized during the 4 years of Trump administration. So I think that these 4 years created a fertile ground where people unapologetically came out in the name of freedom of speech, right, to articulate these kinds of racist discourses. And specifically in terms of CRT, I think it has a lot to do with the Americans' relationship with our past. And I see it as a type of historical revisionism, American historical revisionism, an attempt to rewrite history from the white supremacist perspective and normalize it. So it becomes part of the school curricula, it becomes part of the dominant discourse. Nevertheless, having real material consequences, right, that is racist violence. So this is a really complex debate that at least we as educators, and because we work a lot with teachers in the schools, we discuss and debate a lot in our classrooms, and also in a way train our educators to fence off attacks on critical race theory in the area schools at least.
I'm going to ask a speed round of policy questions with a really brief answers from panelists, if you don't mind. Is social media strengthening freedom and democracy, or is it weakening it? Social media. Is social media strengthening democracy and freedom or weakening it?
I'll take that one on, even though I'm not sure I have a clear answer to it. On the one hand, social media is a forum for speech and the exchange of ideas, and the ability to speak freely, exchange ideas freely, to organize with other people and associate with other people via whatever platform, whether it's in person or in some virtual format. Those are all essential to, I guess, a modern notion of democracy, right? Social media is a sort of public forum. On the other hand, social media can be used to promote the most vile, anti-democratic ideas imaginable and amplify them in really cynical ways. They're also ways of threatening people and inciting violence against people. This is an issue that I've written about, and social media is a breeding ground for threats and incitement, which have anti-democratic effects. The targeting of people based on their race, based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. When those things take place via social media, they are antithetical to freedom and democracy. So the impact of social media is ambivalent.
Thank you. Our masks. We've got 10 minutes. We've got 10 minutes, and I really want to get this one in. Are masks and vaccine mandates breaches of freedom, or do they protect democracy? Darren?
Yeah, so I want to segue from what Joe said as well. I mean, I think that, social media has so radically democratized in one way information. And one definition of democracy certainly is being governed by your neighbors. And, not every one of our neighbors necessarily has the same qualifications on all the issues that our society has to manage. So the democracies have always tried to find this delicate balance between, skills and experience and research on the one hand, and people's freedom to believe what they want to believe. And I do think that there are times where, democracies have to say, you can believe what you want to believe, but you don't get to make policy on that belief, and that sometimes good ideas have to win the day. And so I do think that I do believe that democratic government has a responsibility to take care of its people, and in this sense, vaccines and masks are fairly overwhelmingly supported by evidence as being important. Though in the case of masks, it's clear that those mandates can be finessed in a much better way than they were used, particularly in terms of kids in schools and so on. Now that we've got better data and we've got better research, we can change those mandates so that they reflect our growing knowledge. And I think the same thing with vaccines is that I think, as we learn more over time, we have to change it. But anybody in a position of responsibility has got to make a judgment call when in the moment based on the information that they have. But I think democracies have to make those make those decisions with as good as information and advice as they can get.
Thank you. Panayota, go ahead. On any question.
I wanted to talk on the question of social media. I wanted to agree with you that social media can be, really spaces for debate and democracy, but at the same time, they can breed extremism. And there's a lot of research and literature right now that connects the rise of extremism, the rise of neo-Nazi movements with social media. And this is part of also what I study. I explored Iron March, which is a neo-Nazi site. It also created these echo chambers where people find themselves in digital spaces where they hear what they want to hear exactly, aligned with what they think. But as a last point, I just want to stress that we should not forget that social media are privately owned. So there is so much we can do in this context. So for us, I think a challenge collectively is to be able to find the space to for activism, for action, for change, but not forgetting that Elon Musk, for example, now owns Twitter, so we should not have any illusions about what's really happening.
Thank you. Pam, from public health perspective, vaccines and masks, from a public health perspective? From a public health perspective, can you give us something on masks and vaccine mandates?
Okay. So is that against freedom? So public health, interestingly enough, has always had a lot of power to restrict freedom. And, one of the things, you can go back, there was a Supreme Court case in 1905 that gave Massachusetts the right to vaccinate a person who didn't want to be vaccinated against smallpox. So the powers that government has had with respect to public health have always been quite significant. Now, we can debate whether that's a contravention of democracy or not, but the principle has been sort of widely embraced across, not just in the United States, but in many countries. So this sort of idea that all of a sudden, one of the essences, I think one of the things about public health is it is the one 100% clear example where collective action is 100% necessary. And from a political science perspective, that's kind of interesting, because in many other cases, you can think of cases where, if you take it from the extreme libertarian perspective, individuals can take over, their lives. They can check everything that's bad that's going to happen. They can take full responsibility. But from a public health perspective, you can't control, so much that will affect your health, that it is clearly a case where government is necessary. And government is necessary in order to make sure you have clean water, that the food you eat when you walk into a restaurant is healthy, et cetera, et cetera. So I always think of public health as being a real test in a case in terms of legitimacy of government. And so it's not surprising that now that government is being called into question, so is public health. And these very extreme examples of public health workers who have been attacked and so forth. So I'll let other people take over.
Thank you. Tyson, do you want to ask the last question?
Yes. What can we do at UMass Boston right now to stem the tide?
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I think one of the things we can do best at a university is to promote critical thinking and talk about topics like critical race theory and sexual orientation and gender identity openly in a system that encourages people to exchange ideas, form ideas, learn about each other, and ultimately become accepting of one another and take responsibility for each other's well-being and protect each other's freedom. I think the beacon that we can be is to be a system that doesn't try and suppress those discussions and that provides a forum for those discussions.
Excellent. Darren, I know you have to leave in a minute. Do you want to answer that question?
Yes, thank you. I would just, to add to that, I think I'd be remiss as a conflict resolution person if I didn't say that I think an important thing that we can do is to continue our best to try to reach out to the extremes at the left and right, as much as whatever may be said in those groups, that however any of us feel somebody else being extreme, they are still part of our community and our society, and the more that we leave them on their own, so to speak, and the more that we leave them out in the cold, I think the more it only encourages a lot of the disturbing trends that we're talking about. And love them or hate them, they are bring them home, or at least engage them in a conversation, and engaging folks in these sorts of processes does have a long-term impact of at least moderating a little bit, or at least trying to take the violent edge off of these conversations.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Panayota?
I think we're doing it already, which is the good news. I think what we do here at UMass, and I think I can also speak for many of my colleagues, is that, as you said, we open this space for the kinds of dangerous discussions to take place, so that our students develop an awareness, are exposed to alternative narratives as opposed to just this one narrative, and at some point develop the kind of consciousness that is needed to change things. So I feel very strongly about the fact that we have been doing this at UMass, and we have been doing it very well.
Thank you. Pam, do you want to have the last word?
I think the essence of education is being open to new ideas, but not just to new ideas, but to really listening to people. And so I think that's one of the critical issues that we're having right now, is the inability to be open to other people, to really listen to them, to respect them as individuals. And I hope that all of those values are things that are, put into practice in our classrooms and in our community.
Yep. No, thank you so much, panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. There is going to be an opportunity to engage your questions to our panelists in a minute, but I just felt that we should close this part of the session so that we can network and please eat. So I'd like to thank you from my perspective so much for attending, listening, staying with us. I'd like to thank the panelists as well. And I'd like to invite Dean King Meadows to also close the event.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate the thank yous to the panelists and for those who are watching and for those in the audience. It was a wonderful opportunity for us to learn so much, and we still have more questions than we have time to get to. But this is the wonder and beauty of UMass Boston. Beacons of light and understanding, where you're in a classroom and you're getting so much in the answer to one question from history, gerontology, applied linguistics, political science, communications, economics. We have the faculty here that can take these really tough questions and unpack them in wonderful ways. So thank you for joining us, and let's eat and network and experience the wonder of UMass Boston. Thank you very much.